One thing that I did find in my research, and this is an unexpected finding, is that leaders who are known to have integrity can actually create an environment for employees to create facades. And you may ask, why?
Yeah.
Because leaders with integrity are so valued and people look up to them to the point where if they have values that might be different or they have a divergent perspective, they may say, I love this leader, I trust this leader is great, I'm not going to rock the boat.
Welcome to Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. This season includes 25 incredible episodes devoted to the inner development goals. Based on the science of personal transformation, the IDG framework represents 23 skills needed for today's world. And of course, empathy is one of them. You won't want to miss a single episode, so hit the subscribe button now. Thanks for watching and enjoy the show. Welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy. Today I'm joined by Dr. Patricia Hewlin, a professor of social organizational psychology at the Teachers College of Columbia University. She's passionate about helping leaders, employees, and students create psychologically safe environments where people can bring their true selves to work. Patricia's groundbreaking research explores how leaders and employees engage in authentic self-expression at work and the barriers that often impede it. To that end, she coined the term creating facades of conformity to describe the behavior of suppressing personal values in order to align with organizational expectations. I've invited Patricia to join this special IDG series because her work exemplifies the integrity and authenticity trait within the Inner Development Goals framework, which they define as a commitment and ability to act with sincerity, honesty, and integrity. Welcome to the show, Patricia.
Yeah, Anita, it's such a pleasure to be here. You know, I'm one of your greatest fans, so it's
Oh, it's mutual. My goodness. And McGill lost you a year ago. Montreal lost you a year ago, but we're happy that you're still doing your work and that you're happy and back home, I guess, in New York, right?
yes, I am. I am a native New Yorker, so it is nice to be home. But my 14 years in Montreal were fabulous for the entire family. So we miss Montreal as well.
Oh, we miss you. So
Thank
let's
you.
let's start with the
Sure.
backstory. It's interesting, I find when people delve, you've been doing this work for more than 20 years of research. What brought you to the topic of conformity, authenticity, integrity?
Sure. A lot of it had to do with my experience before going into academia. I often tell people I'm a recovered banker. No shade on bankers at all. So I was in banking. I have my MBA in finance, and I was in the retail side of banking. So I managed a couple of branches for Citi in New York. And although I enjoyed engaging with customers and engaging with employees, I always felt like something was missing. And I found myself very much intrigued by the experiences of my employees. And I was very attuned to my own experiences as a young Black woman in corporate America and how to navigate that environment to fit in, to survive, to succeed. How do you do it? And so I felt pressure to conform to what was perceived to be the professional person in that context, whether it's how we dress, how I wore my hair, how the types of conversations that I held. I was very attuned to, well, what do I need to do in order to be successful? And a lot of it had to do with just conformity pressures that did not necessarily align with how I would define myself, but I had to do it in order to be successful. And so feeling like I'm not quite fitting in per se, I'd like to explore, but what's out there in terms of my own passion. And because of that curiosity, around understanding employee experiences. I had conversations with former professors at New York University. They were sharing with me what they did as professors, and I'm thinking that may be better for me because I enjoy research. I've always loved research, always loved hanging out in bookstores. Hanging out in the library. And so that passion for research was always in me. And I have not looked back because I love having the opportunity to talk to people about their workplace experiences. And I continue to delve into this idea around conformity and authenticity and how do people navigate themselves in workplaces.
Well, so thanks for sharing sort of your own lived experience that brought you into this sort of domain of research. What comes to mind immediately is there's this vocabulary around code switching and intersectionality, right? So
Yeah.
Black woman, young woman, all these things. And then you maybe felt in the workplace that you had to behave and speak in a particular way, and that it kind of was causing angst around identity, I suppose. And, how come I can't be myself in the workplace, right? So that's what you're describing.
Sure, sure. And it's interesting that you have those thoughts that you share regarding, well, why do I have to do this? And so from my perspective, growing up with parents who were part of the civil rights movement, grandparents who were on farms, and they grew up during those they were navigating Jim Crow in the US. And so, from their perspective, they were like, you put your head down and just get to work because no one really cares about your personal life or personal experiences. Be excellent, be more than excellent. And because there's a bigger picture in terms of your community and your family. And so, I didn't really question that,
Mm,
but it was more about how do I do it in a way that feels right
mm,
for me. And
mm.
it's just it was just very stressful. And that's what I actually found in my research, that when people feel that they have to suppress aspects about themselves that are important to them, their values, and that are not quite aligned with what's perceived as valued in the workplace, it is emotionally exhausting.
And I'm sure we're going to talk about the mental health issue and
Yeah.
other impacts that it has on individuals. Okay, so I read out the IDG framing of this
Hmm.
skill set, right? A
Hmm.
commitment and ability to act with sincerity, honesty, and integrity. I'm reading this off this
Hmm.
little cue card. Your website actually describes authenticity as a highly personal endeavor. One size does not fit all. It is a personal journey that involves discovering ways to honor your core values within and outside of the workplace. Could you
Absolutely.
unpack that a little more?
Sure, sure. So, just a very quick definition. Our values are our convictions. Our values tell us what's right, what's wrong, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. And so, our values can range from political values, values connected to our religion, values connected to our culture, values connected to work style. That's particularly important today, where you have people who are very strong about I want to work from home. That's a value that's connected to a value system. There's a value system connected to how we take care of ourselves, our health. And so we have a wide range of thoughts around what is right, what is wrong, and what works for us. And that's why I say that authenticity is a highly individualized journey, because when we are authentic, we are tapping into our values. And then we're also tapping into just our inclinations around how we present ourselves. Some people are more expressive about their authenticity. And unfortunately, we live in a world where those who are more expressive seem to be rewarded a bit more. And often viewed as more authentic. And so when I say one size does not fit all, meaning that I may be quiet in terms of my values, but I'm living my values. I just don't need to share my values with, with everyone. And you have some people who feel that way, and that doesn't make them less authentic than the one who is more expressive about their values. What's key is really understanding what our core values are, what's most important to us, and to make sure that we identify those contexts where we can express them.
Okay, so this is an unanticipated question, but as a follow-up to what you just said,
Mhm.
I think we kind of all sort of know that we are motivated by our values or driven by our values. They're implicit, they're explicit.
Mm.
I think there is real work around actually surfacing our values and getting really clear on what they are so that we're not sort of like, when we make decisions, for example, that we can go back to our values to make a decision in alignment. So, how do we go about really being explicit about our values?
Yeah, I have recently been encouraging people to back into their values by looking at the different contexts that are in their lives. So we have the family, we have the workplace context, we have personal relationships. What decisions are being made in those contexts? And to what degree do you feel that those decisions reflect your desires, reflect who you are? That will give you an idea of, all right, well, yeah, I guess this is a value because I continue to do that.
Hmm.
Could it be achievement? There are some people who are competitive no matter what context they're in. And that's an achievement value. That's not necessarily a negative value. It's just you have to understand the balance and not be extreme in any value that we have, because that can sometimes lead us into error. But having an achievement value, meaning that one wants to be excellent in what they do. They want their relationships to be excellent. That's an achievement value. And
Hmm.
then, as mentioned before, the values around it could be fitness and so on. You're going to have some people say, oh, yeah, I highly value fitness. But if you're not working out, that's an aspirational value. You aspire to have that value. I'm talking to myself now.
January's coming.
Exactly. And so that's the other thing. We have to be, and I think this really goes back to the framework in terms of really being honest with ourselves. And when we think about values, what's our real value that's playing out in our lives versus what we're aspiring to be?
So if people are, some people are self-aware about their values or they can observe their behavior and see how they're living their values, but are there any tools? I know that there's like the Barrett values assessment tool, and then Brené Brown has a bunch in her book.
Yes.
Is there a go-to place for you to use as a tool?
I find that there's a lot of commonality among these different approaches. Schwartz is a tried and true, has a tried and true list of values. That could be a start as well. But again, whatever approach one takes, the key is to really evaluate the behavior, because oftentimes these approaches will say, okay, check off your values.
Mm.
But if your behavior is not matching with that value, it could be that it's aspirational, or it could be that it's a value that's kind of, I call it malleable, meaning that it's not a make it or break it. But it's like, okay, if I do work out once a week, that's great. But if I don't, I'm not going to be really disappointed in myself because it's not really a core value.
Right, right. And I imagine some people also uh, think that they are holders of values and not cognizant of the fact that it's maybe the parental units or society that's
That's
projecting some expectations.
That's exactly right. And we have to be careful about those as well, because we may have certain values. For example, I hate to mention politics, but we may have political values that might guide us in a direction that is not healthy when it comes to building relationships with others. And
Mm.
so we can actually, when I mentioned earlier, we can go a bit extreme, or we can find that there could be some upbringing and some societal forces that are playing a role in terms of us making decisions that are not really working for us
Right.
and working for our relationships with others.
Yeah, and I'm going to come back to the global aspect towards the end of the conversation, so we will
Hmm.
touch on that.
Hmm.
Okay, so you've been conducting leading edge research about what drives conformity and what suppresses authenticity at the workplace for over 2 decades, even though you're still 25.
Thank
30,
you.
32. Okay. Your research has actually shown, and this was quite like when I saw this, my eyebrows went up, that 1 in 3 employees in North America feels pressure to suppress their personal values, and they pretend to go along with the values of their organization. Can you explain what's going on there?
Sure, sure. And so this was based on survey research. And so it was a scale from 1 to 5. And so we looked at those who responded 3 or more. And so, yes, a third, at least a third of employees were responding 3 or more. And I found that to be pretty consistent over time. And so, of course, there are times when we may not agree with what's happening in the organization. But when we start talking about values, we have to be careful. And when we start talking about core values, we have to really be very careful, because when we compromise our core, that's when we experience the distress. And so in the workplace context, I have found that work environments that are not participative, where it's very top down and there's not a lot of employee engagement, where employees can actually offer opinions, offer solutions, those types of environments signal to employees that, well, if you have a divergent perspective, whether it's a value system around your work or a value system around your culture and so on, it's not happening. We don't want it. And so that causes people to feel that, well, I won't share, and I'll even pretend to go along in order to be successful in this work environment. And that's what I've called creating facades of conformity. I've also found that when people hold a minority status in multiple categories, that causes people to feel that, well, there's going to be a bit more attention toward me because I'm different in so many ways. And so the way I recorded that is that I basically asked my participants, do you see yourself as a minority in the workplace? And if they said yes, then I gave them the categories. And those categories are very connected to the different types of values that people would have in the workplace. So the more categories a person checked off, the more likely they felt pressured to suppress their divergent selves and to try to fit in as much as possible in the workplace.
So let's talk about the implications of that. When you've got a third of your workforce that is feeling some degree of conformity, or they
Hmm.
can't express their values, or they feel like they're kind of making some compromises here and there,
Hmm.
how does it
Hmm.
impact the employees? What are the many ways? I suppose it's not just one way.
Yeah.
And how does it impact the organization?
Sure. So I have found, we talked about emotional exhaustion. There's also a negative relationship with the commitment that employees have with the organization, meaning that if another opportunity comes along, the employee is more likely to take it. And there's another outcome, the intention to leave the organization. I've always found that to be an ironic type of outcome, because people are creating facades in order to fit in, but they're still thinking about leaving the organization. And so there tends to be this intention to leave. It's almost as if as soon as something comes, I'm leaving. Now I have to do this.
Mm.
But my eyes are set towards a better context.
Mhm.
Lower levels of work engagement. I found that in my research as well. And of course, we want employees who are going to be excited about their work and who are energetic about what they do. There's a negative relationship between creating facades of conformity and work engagement. And so, I mean, the list goes on in terms of the negative effects that it has on an individual employee, which will have negative effects in terms of how an organization can learn and grow and be innovative.
Yeah. So it matters to the workplace on those many domains. I imagine there's a mental health component to it as well.
Yeah, yes. And that's the next phase of my research to make those connections. We know that there's a well-being connection. And in my research, I've seen it in terms of emotional exhaustion, and the research on authenticity in general has shown that when people are not authentic, they tend to have higher levels of depressive symptoms. And so the notion of well-being and mental health is definitely connected to this as well.
Yeah, because I imagine if you have to put on these facades of conformity, there's a cognitive pull, there's a cognitive drain to that. That's why it's so tiring.
Yeah.
And then if you don't feel immediately included, the sense of belonging that we have as creatures, as humans, is also stymied. So you probably also feel the anxiety amygdala of like, new conversations, new spaces, new environments, new relationships.
Sure, sure. And the conformity also serves as a way to feel as if one belongs. There's an attempt to want to belong. And so, how can one conform in a way that they're not standing out?
Mm.
And so that's the other part of it as well. So all of these somersaults in order to fit in and have a sense of belonging is what a lot of employees experience.
So what feedback or advice would you offer to employees in terms of how they can manage that? And then also what would you say to the employers about how they can do better?
hmm First of all, understand that the workplace is only one context in your life.
Mm,
And it could be that in that work context, you might not be able to live out all of your core values. Can you live out one or two is really the question, or more, whatever's most important to you for that context. If you can't, and for example, if you're in an environment that is not supporting your work family values, that I would hope will cause one to pause and ask oneself, well, is this context worth it?
mm,
That's really important because there are some work contexts where they're actually making efforts to create a better environment around authenticity, but it's slow. Change can often be slow, and we see it in society. So if society is not moving the way we would like to see it move, of course the workplace is not. The workplace is a microcosm of what's happening in the broader world. And so we have to just be realistic in terms of our ability to live out our core values in certain contexts. So if you're in a context and hey, you need a job, you need to stay in that job for whatever reason, what other context can you express those core values? What community organizations, religious organizations, whatever it might be, where you can say, well, I don't get it I don't get it all in at work, but I am true in this environment.
mm.
That's key because that really links back to this notion of mental health.
Yeah.
And so we are responsible for our mental health and how we navigate whether we express or suppress our values.
Mhm. And then to workplaces, what advice have you got to leaders who are looking to create an environment, a culture where authenticity can flourish?
Absolutely. First of all, leaders, you have to walk the talk. One thing that I did find in my research, and this is an unexpected finding, is that leaders who are known to have integrity can actually create an environment for employees to create facades. And you may ask, why?
Yeah.
Because leaders with integrity are so valued and people look up to them to the point where if they have values that might be different or they have a divergent perspective, they may say, I love this leader. I trust this leader is great. I'm not going to rock the boat. I'd rather just suppress divergent perspectives and go along with this leader because of the benefits that I receive from this leader with integrity. So, it's really it's interesting. And so, what I tell leaders who are known to have integrity, this also goes with leaders who are highly charismatic. You're big in the room. And so that means that people may actually look up to you, but they may be intimidated. And
Mhm.
so it's important that leaders say, look, I need divergent perspectives.
Mm,
I want you to bring your difference in.
mm,
I want you to be engaged with your true selves so that we can learn from each other. I need feedback. These should be a part of ongoing conversations so that you create an environment where people say, hey, this leader does value difference. This leader does want feedback. And when people are being expressive and authentic, hey, leaders, say, you know what? I appreciate your authenticity.
mm.
I appreciate this authenticity and encourage others to do the same.
But then you're really talking about psychological safety writ large.
Oh, absolutely. 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 I'm currently conducting research now where psychological safety actually explains a lot of why people feel uncomfortable or comfortable being authentic in the workplace. Psychological safety is a key factor.
So, okay, I'm imagining that the work that you do within an organizational space can find its way into like a lot of different, conversations, whether it's like how can we innovate better or how can we have less absenteeism or less turnover, like a lot of different ways. But I also think it could find its way in sort of like the DEI conversation. And I'm wondering if you have anything to say about how you've noticed the DEI upswing that happened a few years ago and then the backlash and sort of what you would say about this the important work of EDI with that is still has value that is now sort of people are allergic to for all sorts of bells and whistles.
Sure, sure. There are a number of things that I'd like to say about that. First of all, creating an environment for authenticity is inclusion, and that's for everyone. Everyone benefits from an environment of authenticity. The challenge is for organizations to manage it in a way that we're that employees are being so authentic that there's clashes happening and the work is not getting done. And so the big thing now, I would say, is how do you define inclusion and in a way that we understand we're talking about belonging and authenticity, and how do we do that in a way that, all right, we as a unit, as an institution, understand what authenticity means, and we understand that there's respect that's involved with being authentic, and that we're not just going to be authentic for the sake of doing that and just say it the way we want to say it, really adding some rules of engagement around that. And yeah, I would say that it would be a shame to let go of those DEI initiatives that were benefiting everyone in terms of creating an inclusive an environment of belonging.
Yeah,
Now,
when delivered well. Yeah.
with that said, I'm working on some research led by Rachel Arnett at the Wharton School. And we've been looking at the fact that sometimes these initiatives place such a burden on particularly people of color, and that and leaders are saying, be authentic, express yourselves, manifest that identity to the point where it's too much. And it really speaks to the notion that I said earlier that it's one size does not fit all. And everyone does not want to be expressive about everything, especially when it comes to matters related to one's culture or race or gender or sexual identity.
Mhm.
People are not the representatives
Mhm.
of those identities. And in these, sometimes in these diversity climates, it's like there's such a push to the point where it adds undue pressure.
Yeah. Last question about the workplace. What about young people? You know, the idea that they have a whole different set of values around identity, around fluidity, around collaboration,
Mhm.
around work-life balance. So what are you hearing from younger folks about authenticity in the workplace?
Sure, sure. They're navigating it just as well or just as difficult with similar difficulty as older people.
Mm,
They're, of course, the younger generation they are more expressive in terms of their political, social values, etc. In the context of the workplace, they still want to be successful. They still want to develop in their careers. And so they're still trying to figure out what does authenticity mean in this context.
mm,
And I even found in my own research that in environments where there's job insecurity, the older workers were more authentic than
mm,
the younger workers. The older workers did not, I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that they have more experience.
mm,
They're thinking more about legacy. And so they were less, well, I would say less concerned about creating facades. They were not interested as much as the younger employees who were more concerned about, well, I'm just getting started. I'm trying to figure out how to navigate this work environment. And so we're all
I'm
trying to
wondering,
figure this thing out.
well, then I'm wondering as a point of curiosity whether or not the impact on the younger generation, if they feel a greater sense of conformity, if there's job security at risk, but the value system of the younger generation is to be expressive of
No,
full identity, that maybe their mental health is more at risk.
it could be. That could be. That's a fantastic research question.
Mm, mm.
Mhm.
Okay, so Patricia, I want to go back to the inner development goals specifically. They were created, as far as my understanding goes, in response to the fact that humanity is doing such a poor job at achieving the SDGs, right? So the IDGs are meant to support the success of the SDGs. So here we are, it's the very end of 2024. We have 6 years to go, so now five by the time this comes out, and we've only achieved 12% of the goals. And right, so a few years ago, people were like, what is going on that we cannot harness the intelligence and the ingenuity to achieve some of these major goals for humanity? And so they invited and curated a set of meetings among thought leaders around systems change, and they came to the conclusion that we need a different set of leadership skills to achieve the goals that we want for humanity. And so these 23 skills, which I know are probably next year going to land on maybe a couple of more, because there's been talk, they've been getting feedback from the global majority saying there's a few skills that are not here. This is like a sort of slightly Western set of skills. One
Mhm.
of them I know is forgiveness, for example. Forgiveness and reconciliation is another skill that they think should be brought forward. And there's others. I just wonder what you would say about authenticity and integrity from the perspective of the kind of skills we need to develop as leaders to create the kind of world we want.
Yeah, yeah. What's critical about authenticity is that we don't engage in authenticity in a bubble. We are inherently relational. And it's important to understand that our decisions have an impact on the decisions of others. Particularly as leaders, it's important to understand that their authenticity could have a negative impact on others if it's not done in a way that does not consider the well-being of others, does not consider the space that others should have in certain contexts. And I'll give you an example. Leaders who are valuing employees who are very vocal because there's a vote, the leader themselves are vocal, and they're valuing that versus understanding that people express themselves in different ways. So if we're going to engage in this concept of authenticity, it's just important to understand your context and really treat authenticity as a very precious tool that should not be weaponized to speak our minds, as I mentioned earlier, with not really considering others. That should not be used in a way that shuts other people down, taking up so much space that others really don't feel that they can be authentic. And so again, the relational component of authenticity is critical.
Yeah, I hear you on that. And I want to ask a follow-up question. If you feel comfortable answering it, great. We don't have to include it in the, I can remove this out of the
Sure.
podcast. But, and this is outside the scope of your research a little bit, but within the general, I'm sure you've thought of it. What do you think about humanity at 2024? How far our human values, I mean, I don't know if there are some core values that run across all the time, but how they're rubbing up against the systems that we're in now that are quite hegemonic forces, and how we are living our lives somewhat in dissonance with our core values.
And so I guess is your question really about how do we navigate an environment that seems to be so dissonant to who we are in terms of our own sense of human dignity and civility?
Yes.
I have a lot of hope.
Mm.
I have a lot of hope for people like you and the students I teach who carry the principles around compassion, human dignity, civility. And so despite the many forces that are out there that tend to be loud, that are seem so in conflict and opposition to what we know is true, there are many, 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 many others who must continue to do the work. And I say to my students, let's all just do what we know to do. If we all do what we know to do, we can continue to chip away at the mountain that's in front of us.
That's hopeful. Last question, Pat. My favorite, well, not my favorite, but I love to ask this question at the end of my podcast because I never know what I'm going to get. And that is coming back to empathy. If you can think of a time in your life when you were on the receiving end of empathy and what that meant for you.
When I think of empathy, I think of my early days of when I was a child. And I recall being bullied by someone in elementary school. And I had one friend who did not go along with that bully and understood what I was going through. And we became very, very close friends. Because I remember the bully said to the others, don't talk to her. And so all the other kids weren't talking to me except for Jenny. Jenny did not. And we became friends. And that was my early experience of someone really taking my perspective, being empathetic, and really considering me and being my friend.
What did that mean for you?
Oh, it meant the world to me. It actually infused affirmation, and it also helped instill a sense of confidence in myself as an individual, and that I could have friends and that people can love me on my peer level. I knew I was loved at home, but just on a peer level. And so empathy is very, very affirming, very affirming.
Well, we love Jenny, and I think the
Yes.
invitation at the end of this conversation always is we can be a little bit more Jenny. We can all turn up the volume of empathy in our lives, and it always has such an important impact on people in ways that we can't even calculate or know,
Absolutely.
and that we would all benefit from a little more empathy in the world.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Anita, for all you do.
Likewise, Pat, thanks for spending the hour with me, and thank you all for watching and listening. We will see you next week at Purposeful Empathy.
If you know someone who'd benefit from this episode, please share it with them. Post the link on your socials and hit the subscribe button now. The world needs more empathy, and you have an important role to play.